totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Laurie Jacobson is our guest to talk about her book, Top of the Mountain, The Beatles at Shea Stadium 1965, which came out in August through Backbeat Books. On a sweltering Sunday evening in August 1965, 56,000 people traveled by plane, car, bus, ferry, and subway train to pack New York's Shea Stadium. They were there not for a ball game, but a rock and roll concert. The audacious dream of promoter Sid Bernstein. No band had ever played a baseball stadium, and few believed it could be pulled off. But on that glorious night, the Beatles sold out Shea Stadium, shattering all existing box office and attendance records in show business history. Against a backdrop of mounting political and cultural tumult, Top of the Mountain delivers the details and excitement of Shea and the spirited, curious new generation who would soon claim the decade for its own. Packed with hundreds of color photographs, it gives a one-of-a-kind account of this monumental event, gathering first-person interviews and quotes from dozens of those who experienced a piece of pop culture history. Celebrities, writers, agents, producers, photographers, opening act performers, security guards, radio personalities, cameramen, and fans of all kinds. Among them were young Caryn Johnson, later known as Whoopi Goldberg, Louise Streep, later known as Meryl Streep, and Steven Lento, later known as Steven Van Zandt. Future Beatle wives Linda Eastman and Barbara Bach, established stars like Bobby Vinton and Ed Sullivan, and artists such as Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Felix Cavaliere and the Rascals, Marvin Gaye, and more. Together, they paint an unforgettable picture of a night like no other. Laurie Jacobson is an award-winning author, leading Hollywood historian, and reformed stand-up comic. She's written and produced documentaries, television series, and specials like the 20th anniversary of The Mary Tyler Moore Show and the Museum of Television and Radio's Salute to Funny Women of Television. Her other books include Hollywood Heartbreak, Hollywood Haunted, Dishing Hollywood, Timmy's in the Well, The John Provost Story, and TV Dinners. She's a frequent guest on radio and podcasts, and I'm happy to have her on this one. To hear the songs that made up the Beatles' 12-song set list at Shea, head over to the show notes page. Hi, Laurie. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. Excited to be here.
At the time, plans for the Beatles to play at Shea got underway. Many still thought they were still just a fad. The critics hated the band, which is amazing to think of, too. You included some reviews in your book. George McKinnon of the Boston Globe, and this is dated February 16th, 1964. He writes, quote, "Don't let the Beatles bother you. If you don't think about them, they will go away. And in a few more years, they will probably be bald." Enjoy your Beatlemania. But there was one promoter who believed the Beatles were here to stay, and he plays a huge role in getting the Beatles at Shea, and that is Sid Bernstein. He often gets overlooked. Yes. Most people point to Ed Sullivan as the guy who breaks the Beatles in the U.S., but Sid deserves credit for not just the Beatles, but the entire British invasion here in the States. Can you talk about Sid?
That is also true. Sid was a concert promoter in New York. His territory was New York, and he booked really class, high-end acts like Tony Bennett, Judy Garland, people of that ilk. And Sid was always looking to improve himself. So he would take classes occasionally, keep his mind sharp. And he was taking a class in New York, and the assignment was to read papers from other countries. And he could only read English, so he could only read the British papers. And of course, he went right to the entertainment section, and he kept seeing articles about a band called the Beatles appearing in smaller cities in the UK and in Germany. And the word pandemonium was attached to every review. And he naturally caught his attention. And after he saw it 5, 6, 7 times, he thought, I got to know who these people are. And he found out who their manager was, Brian Epstein, and finally got his phone number and got Brian's mom on the phone and basically said, "Can Brian come out to play?" And Brian had been hoping America would call. Sid was the first one. And they weren't getting any airplay in New York yet. So Sid said, I'd like them to do Carnegie Hall, and let's set it enough time in advance so that they will be on the air here in New York, which they finally were by December of 63. And he had set them up to play Carnegie Hall in February of 64. Now, it just so happens that around the time Ed Sullivan and his wife are traveling, and they end up in Heathrow Airport in London on the same day the Beatles are arriving. And they see thousands of screaming girls. Ed says, "What's this? These guys have to be on my show." Finds out Sid's already beaten him to the punch and is bringing them to America. So he hops on Sid's coattails. He knew Sid. He called them. "Would you mind if I had them on the Sunday before their Carnegie Hall show?" And Sid thought, well, that guarantees me a sellout. "Sure, Ed, go ahead." So Ed gets all the glory for that. And Sid was a very modest man. You know, Sid really kind of gave it away. And jumping the gun a little bit there, Ed decided to film the Shea Stadium concert and make a documentary of it. And he skipped right over Sid and made the deal with Brian Epstein. And neither one of those men included Sid on the deal. And Sid should have said something, because there'd have been no documentary if Sid hadn't created the Shea Stadium concert. But Sid just nodded his head and thought, so goes the business.
And Brian wasn't keen on the idea of Shea, right? Sid had to talk him into that.
Oh, yeah. No, because of the doubters that you mentioned, Brian said, well, we play a place that size, it'll be half empty, and those naysayers will come out and say, "See, I told you, passing fad. They'll never last." And he said, "My boys don't play to empty seats." So Sid said to him, "I will pay you $10 for every empty seat in the stadium." Now, when ticket prices were like $5, that was a pretty hefty offer, and one that Brian couldn't turn down. So Brian said, "Okay, but here's my stipulation." First of all, he asked for $100,000 guarantee. And that was just ginormous in those days. And he said, "Until I have half of that, you can't advertise the concert." And Sid said, "Well, how am I going to raise 50 grand if I can't advertise?" And Brian said, "Well, I didn't say you couldn't talk about it." And now this is my favorite part of the whole story.
I love this story, yeah.
So Sid, meanwhile, Sid's wife is beside herself. They just have a little baby. They're about to have another. He's promised $10 for every empty seat. Now he has to come up with 50 grand. And she's screaming, "Sid, what have you done to us?" And so he's depressed as all get out. He goes every day to Washington Square Park with his little baby, and he begins telling teenage girls, "I'm bringing the Beatles to Shea in 8 months." He got a P.O. box. He told them what the ticket prices were, and every day he passed out that information. So after 3 weeks, he finally had the nerve to go to his P.O. box, and they bring out bags and bags. I mean, everyone comes out to look. Finally, we get to see who's behind this box. And inside those bags was money from every country you could imagine. Rubles from Russia.
That's so cool.
Just, at a time when there was long distance phone calling and letters, that news went around the world. And I just love that teenage girls and a few boys spread the word like that.
It's almost hard to believe, but that's what happened. You cover the months leading up to the Shea concert in great detail, and you build the suspense, with each page. And I want to go through some of these moments. The show was scheduled for August 15th, 1965, and things are moving along until Sid gets a call from the mayor in March of 65, and it's bad news. What was the problem, and how does Sid get out of that jam?
Well, New York was pretty terrified about it for many reasons. First of all, they thought it would create an unbelievable traffic jam with everybody trying to get to Shea. And they were terribly worried about security. You know, if 10,000 people decided to rush the stage, there would have been very little anybody could do about it. So Sid had to make a lot of promises, both to the mayor and to Brian about security, because Brian was pretty worried about that as well. They had thousands of uniformed police there. They had hundreds of mounted police. They had wooden barricades set up. And Sid also brought judo to New York. Okay. He brought martial arts to New York. So if all of those barriers failed, he had 200 judo experts ready to take on the mob.
I love it. Now, by the way, this is the first concert of any kind to be held in a stadium, right? I mean, this has never been done before.
The Beatles had played smaller stadiums twice, but nothing this size. And frankly, Eric, no one had ever played to this many people. Not Elvis, not Sinatra. Nobody had ever played to 56,000 people, and nobody had ever gotten that paycheck before. Both of those things broke all of showbiz records to that date.
So, yeah, in defense of Brian, I'm sure he's thinking, this has never been done before. We're not going to sell this out, and they sell out. How fast was it? It wasn't a record sellout, right? And that was Grand Funk Railroad would end up breaking that record years later.
Yeah, well, there was no Ticketmaster or internet. Actually, Sid and his wife hired 8 student nurses to help them go through all the tickets, and that took 3 weeks. Of opening envelopes and sorting everything. You handle the quarters. You handle the single dollars. He even developed that process. So yeah, it was all brand new territory.
Unbelievable. Old school. And the timing of this concert couldn't have been better. The legendary DJ Cousin Brucey, who's still going, right? He's still on Sirius XM. He's awesome. He talked to you about Beatlemania being at a fever pitch, and he had a funny story about seeing the Beatles in every bathroom.
Oh, Sid was totally old school. That is the phrase for him. And when he met Brian 3 months later, he not only had half of the guarantee, he had the whole, Megillah. He gave him $100,000 and Brian's mind was blown. Now Sid was free to advertise the concert, but the concert was already a sellout. So it was silly to print up posters, but he wanted to create the anticipation and excitement. So everywhere he went, he slapped stickers up on every wall. And, Cousin Brucey joked, in every bathroom I went to in New York, Sid Bernstein had been there with his stickers.
Yeah. Sid and Ed Sullivan agreed to film the show. They bring in some heavy hitters to help out, including one guy who would go on to shoot all 3 Godfather films. You mentioned that in the book. But these guys were worried. Like you said, they were worried about being caught in a stampede since they planned on, they were going to be in the audience. So, again, unknown territory. These guys were freaking out a little bit, right?
Yeah. First of all, for the documentary, yes, they had like 14 cinematographers. One of them, as you mentioned, was Gordon Willis, who shot all the Godfather movies and many, many of Woody Allen's films. And many of those guys were shooting early TV, The Naked City, and all kinds of wonderful shows of the time. And incredible talent on the field. Andy Laszlo was in charge of the whole thing, and he was going to the stadium constantly because he just had to know what it was going to sound like up in the stands and down on the field, and there was a lot of test filming done to get ready for the entire process.
I would think audio too, because this is again, these are the early days of concerts of this size. So I know you had stories from people that were way out. I think, was it, who was the one that was way out in the nosebleeds? Was it Meryl Streep was the one, I think?
Yeah.
She said, but, you know, so the sound wasn't going to be all that hot, you know, so they had to do the best with what they had. I mean, what kind of sound system did they have?
Oh, it was just kind of a joke. There were these Vox speakers, you know, maybe they had 20 or 30 set up in front of the stage, and that didn't carry at all. The guys shooting the documentary had their own microphones taped to the microphones the Beatles were using for the Vox speakers. But the way Shea Stadium is built, all of the screaming from the top of the stadium came down directly onto the Beatles. You know, it was sort of like a Greek amphitheater.
Right. Like a shell almost.
Yes, Andy Laszlo actually suffered permanent hearing damage that night, no matter what he stuffed in his ears to try and quell the noise. Everybody I spoke to, the noise is the first thing they talk about. The screaming was out of control. And Ringo summed it up really precisely. People didn't come to hear us, they came to see us. And those 56,000 people there that night, it was the absolute height of Beatlemania. They just wanted to breathe the same air. They just wanted to see the boys, no matter how small they were on the field. You know, for them, that moment, it was, they really exist. They're as adorable as we hoped they would be. And everyone was just, you know, even Meryl Streep today, when she talks about it, the thrill of that night is still with her. It has not faded, and it has not faded for anyone that I spoke to that was there.
And I love the stories in the book about some of the other people that were there at the show that went on to huge success. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who went on to produce films, a studio executive, CEO of DreamWorks Animation. How does he end up at that show?
He was an intern in the mayor's office, you know, which just shows you what a go-getter he was from the start. And the mayor thought, in case we have another big event like this in New York, we'd love for Jeffrey to shadow you, Sid Bernstein. And Sid said, absolutely. You know, I'd love to have him. And I understand that Sid was absolutely wonderful with him, never spoke down to him, consulted him constantly through the evening, asked him if he had any questions. And years later, another friend of Sid's was traveling with him, and the phone rang in their hotel room. And when the other gentleman answered it, it was Jeffrey Katzenberg saying, "Is the nicest man in show business there?"
Yeah. When did Sid pass away? What was?
You know, I don't have the exact date in my head. He was 95.
Oh, really? Okay. He lived a long.
Yeah, he
life.
lasted a good long time. I think it was in the last 10 years.
WABC in New York, they were there. They got a sweet deal thanks to playing the Beatles songs before other stations did, right? They were getting on that gravy train. They were even renamed WA Beatles C. And
that's right.
Cousin Brucey was the DJ. He had a great story about all the kids at the Warwick Hotel in the city trying to meet the guys, the Fab Four. What are some of the memories he shared from that day?
You know, he was inside the hotel, literally hanging out the window while his producer held onto his belt and covering the sea of kids waiting in front of the hotel. Thousands of them. And every single one of them was holding a transistor radio. For your younger audience, we all carried little transistor radios with a little earphone, and we only listened to music. Maybe some of the boys listened to sports, but mostly we only listened to music. And everybody was listening to Cousin Brucey to know when the Beatles were going to arrive. So suddenly this limo pulls in, And even Cousin Brucey thinks it must be the Beatles. It's a limo. In reality, the Beatles had landed and they're on their way to the hotel and they're listening to Cousin Brucey and they're thinking, what in the world is going on?
And there's no school too, right? August 15th. So these kids are out of school. They got all day to go nuts over the Beatles.
Absolutely. So this other mop top group of four guys in little suits come piling out of the limo and into the Warwick Hotel. And Cousin Brucey said the sea of girls moved in one gigantic wave. They knocked down actual horses, the mounted police. Horses went down, which, from the girls just surging forward. And it turns out wasn't the Beatles at all, was some band posing as the Beatles and trying to get into the hotel and trying to get a little attention for themselves. And they basically were never heard from again.
Yeah.
But that was just one of the things going on. And Brucey said girls had their parents rent hotel rooms for them so they could be in the hotel. Brucey got on the elevator and he heard weird noises, and there were girls on top of the elevator where, they easily could have been killed.
Yeah.
Just trying to get to what floor the Beatles were on, or delivering, linens dressed as maids of the hotel. And
Beatlemania. I mean, that's it. I mean, it's mania. The day of the show was a sweltering hot day, right? 87 degrees, but the humidity was really high. Some amazing stories that you have and pictures of the scene outside the stadium. Fans lining up to get in, and you've got a story from Whoopi Goldberg, who says her mother surprised her with tickets.
Yeah, Whoopi was 9, and she loved the Beatles. She just loved them. And her mother, single mom home, and she couldn't afford the tickets. And to this day, Whoopi doesn't know how she got tickets. But her mom said, come on, we're going somewhere. And they got on the subway and they're riding and they get out to Queens. And Whoopi says, what are we doing here, Mom? And she holds up 2 tickets and says, we're going to see the Beatles. And Whoopi said, my head just exploded.
Oh. Now, what were the ticket prices? What did they range from, lowest to highest?
They ranged from $350 to $450 to $550.
Yeah, $550. Wow.
I know.
Yeah, and
I went the next year. I went in '66
cool.
In St. Louis, where I'm from, and I think we paid $6. And I remember my father complaining about that. $6.
Yeah. Oh, do you still have the ticket?
I have my stubs. Yep.
Oh man. Meryl Streep was only 16 at the time, and she had to convince her parents to let her go, right?
Yes, some boy invited her to go, and she lived in New Jersey. It wasn't like they were going down the street to a movie or the malt shop. They were going to New York, and her parents weren't so sure about it. And she said she washed dishes and cleaned the house for a couple of weeks until she finally got permission.
How did you find out that these people were at this concert? I mean, just over the years, they told these stories and you picked up on it and said, I got to get a hold of them. How did that all come together? Yeah,
Meryl presented Paul McCartney with a Lifetime Achievement Award somewhere. And she told the story there. So I knew she had gone. And Whoopi spoke about it in Ronnie Howard's documentary, The Touring Years, 8 days a week, The Touring Years, which is about 3 years old now. And she talked about going. So I knew they were there. And then, other names just popped up. Of course, Facebook helped me find a lot of people. I also, got a hold of at least one person from every opening act that was there. And the audience was very impatient and screamed, "We want the Beatles," through all of the acts. And most of the acts said, we didn't blame them. If we were out there, we wouldn't want to see us either. But one lady in the very first opening act was a group of discotheque dancers. And she went with her dad to the stadium. And while I'm asking her about her experiences, she said, well, Dad took 80 color slides that night. And, we looked at them once and we put them in a drawer. Would you like them?
Oh.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I found a lot of people like that. Carly Simon's brother, Peter, was there. He was, I think, 17. And he took a lot of pictures of the crowds and the bed sheets turned into banners hanging from the upper decks and the cops lined up outside. He had some wonderful stuff that way. And this great guy named Mark Weinstein, who was also 17, he sneaked into Shea Stadium down below. He tried every door that he came across to try and get out on the field. The first one that opened was full of New York City cops. And he thought, oh, he was Jewish. He said, oy vey, what am I going to do now? And so he just thinking on his feet, he walked up to the first cop he saw, put on a British accent, said he was a friend of George Harrison's and had gotten separated from the group. And he's supposed to be out on the field taking pictures. And they walked him right out.
You got to be kidding. Wow.
He stood between Brian Epstein and Ed Sullivan and Murray the K. And nobody thought to ask him, hey, kid, what are you doing here? He had a nice camera. He laminated a business card from his local radio station, and I guess they thought he was a pro. And he took 60 pictures from the edge of the stage, one of which is the cover of the book. And I have all of his photos as well.
That's cool. The other thing that's interesting is I didn't know George was petrified of heights, and he's got to get into a helicopter.
Yeah, he was white knuckling it the whole time, and I'm surprised he didn't get sick to his stomach. Because they had no time to see the city. I mean, the Beatles could never go out anywhere because they were mobbed. So the helicopter pilot thought he'd do them a favor and show them a little bit of downtown. Here's the Chrysler Building. Here's the Empire State Building. And George was literally screaming, get us down. And then they had to land across from Shea Stadium.
That's the other thing.
Yeah, in the World's Fair was going on at that time, and they landed there, and they thought if we pull in a limo, we're going to be mobbed. How can we sneak them into the arena? And there was a Brinks truck, a Wells Fargo van. And they said, let's use the van. And poor George was also claustrophobic. So they seal him up in the back of this windowless van. That poor guy. Man. By the time he got into Shea Stadium, he was just
drained,
exhausted.
Yeah, drained. Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories in the book. And that's how they end up getting an armored truck to put the band in, because the limo was going to be mobbed by fans. So they were smart enough at that point to know, we're not doing that. Can you tell, is it John Lociano, right? He's got a story about the armored truck, and he manages to get that. He gets one last minute, right?
Yes, it was absolutely last minute. And he was working security for the World's Fair. And he was asked to be present when the Beatles landed there because, they couldn't land the helicopter at Shea for fear that kids would run out there and be terribly injured. So then when the problem came up, how are we going to get them into the stadium? He just looked around and saw the Wells Fargo truck, talked to the driver, and the driver said, for insurance purposes, I have to drive, but tell him to get in the back. And Lociano found 4 Wells Fargo badges, and he handed them out to each one of the boys, and they wore them that night on their suits.
Now, it's interesting, too, because when they show up there, they had no idea just how popular they were in the States. They were overwhelmed by that response.
They had no idea. Yeah, that Cousin Brucey said that they weren't prepared for how they were welcomed here. And they were scared to go out there. They didn't know what was going to happen. Mick Jagger was also there that night, and with Keith Richards. And he, the Stones weren't quite as popular as the Beatles were at that point. As a matter of fact, later that evening, Mick asked Sid Bernstein, "Hey, do you think we'll ever be able to play a stadium, Sid?" Sid was like, "Maybe in a couple of years, Mick." So
Dylan
Mick
was there too, right? Bob Dylan was there to hang out, wasn't he? Or was he at the hotel?
He came to their hotel room. He wasn't at the concert, but Mick was there with Alan Klein, who was also a manager, and Alan Klein was hoping to lure the Beatles away from Brian Epstein. So he went to the concert. He brought his biggest client with him, Bobby Vinton, and he had just signed the Rolling Stones. So Mick and Keith came to Shea. And Bobby Vinton is making his way down to the dressing room with Mick, and these tough guys from the Bronx start beating up Mick Jagger. "Hey, you're not so hot, you think you're great." And Bobby said, Mick started to run and I started to run. And then Bobby said, and then I stopped running. He said, "They're not beating me up." So Bobby casually made his way to the dressing room. But, when the Beatles heard that Mick had been attacked out there, they thought, this could be bad. But Cousin Brucey is the one who assured them there is nothing but love waiting for you when you walk out there. And he was right.
Yeah, a lot of positive energy out there. And by the way, Brian Epstein was burned out by this point, because you talk about that in the book, when Sid met up with him and his just face was ashen, just exhausted.
Yeah, and, that was the start of his addiction to pills to keep him up and then to put him to sleep, and a little alcohol mixed in with there, which led to his untimely death in 1967.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. The band writes down their set list on a scorecard they find in the dressing room. Unfortunately, nobody knows what happened to that scorecard. That's
somebody has it.
Somebody has to have it, yeah. So what was the experience like for the opening acts? Brenda Holloway and the King Curtis Band, Cannibal, the Headhunters, is that what they're called?
Cannibal and the Headhunters.
Yeah, Sounds Incorporated, and the Young Rascals.
Okay, now a lot of people think that the Rascals played that night. They were there because Sid had just signed them, but they didn't play. At that point, they were playing a club out in Jersey or Long Island, and they were popular in the neighborhood, but nobody really knew who they were yet. As a matter of fact, someone from the stadium came to Sid before the concert and said, "Hey, there's a screen here that you could put a message on. You don't want to waste this. You get it. You've got the studio." And so Sid said, "All right, put the Rascals are coming. The Rascals are coming." And creating that buzz that Sid was so famous for. And when Brian got to the stadium and saw one look at that, he turned to Sid and quietly said, "If that is not removed in the next 10 seconds, we are leaving." So nobody rides on the coattails of the Beatles.
Yeah. So that was last minute. The Young Rascals was like a last minute decision. So they weren't even on the bill. They weren't even promoted by the local stations or nothing like that. Yeah.
They were there and they were absolutely and utterly thrilled. You asked me about the opening acts, and I said that they cried out for the Beatles through all of the acts. But Cannibal and the Headhunters had a hot song at that time, "Land of a Thousand Dances." And they went on second to last. And that song went over so great because the other acts, most people just weren't paying attention. They could have cared less. But that song caught everybody's attention because it was on the radio. So after that, they moved them to the last position for the rest of the tour because that was the hot song. Sounds Inc. was a band from London the Beatles met them in Hamburg and they became very good friends. And they also signed with Brian Epstein. And they played on Sgt. Pepper's, and they had a big horn section. And they were super. Oh, I got great interviews from them. And one of the reasons that they opened frequently for the Beatles was because they kept their mouths shut. There were a lot of girls and a lot of smoking pot and some pills. And, they had girlfriends and wives back at home. And they had people who had betrayed them before, limo drivers and different people that were in and out of the Beatles' lives sold their stories.
So the Beatles could trust Sounds Inc. They could trust.
Yes, and that's why they were frequently with them.
The Beatles hit the stage around 9. Ed Sullivan introduces them, and the screams are so loud that you can't even hear the band. It just got so crazy. There was a quote from someone there, Renee Purst. She didn't remember much other than the noise. I love that. I don't remember much, but I remember the noise. And a 12-song set list started with Twist and Shout. They played I Feel Fine, Ticket to Ride, Can't Buy Me Love, A Hard Day's Night, Help. They also, did they do some covers in there, I think? It was a few covers.
Yeah, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby was one of the covers. They cut that for the documentary. One of the reasons was because the cameras had to change film at that time and they didn't get the whole song.
Right. Yeah.
And also, why pay royalties to somebody besides the Beatles? So they just used the songs the Beatles wrote, except for Twist and Shout.
And then somehow the band gets out safely after the show, but this wasn't easy either. How do they pull this off? Because they had to make sure John, Paul, George, and Ringo didn't have to run from the stage to the dugout because they knew that wasn't going to happen.
Oh, no. Yeah, that couldn't happen. A car pulled up right behind the stage, and before the audience really knew what was happening, the Beatles were in the car and out the back door of the stadium, gone. And kids did try to jump onto the car as it was driving through, but it all happened so quickly. And that was the point. The Ronettes were also there. And when they left in a limo, the kids thought it was the Beatles, and those girls were terrified. I mean, they are rock. I think they were in a Bentley, some big, heavy car, and it was, rocking back and forth, and kids pressed up against it. I mean, you're worried for yourself. You're worried for the kids, that they could be hurt. And they got Ronnie Spector got a little taste of what it was like to be a Beatle, and it didn't taste good.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing they always talk about. It's so great to be a famous rock star. But we know when the Beatles talk about those days, yeah, a lot of great memories, but it was just out of control, and they had to live in a bubble. Yeah, and the stories of George, I never knew. I can just only imagine for him having to go through all that stuff. I don't know, did they ever do helicopters before or after that, or was that the only time?
I'm not sure, but I do know that later on this tour, because they went on, to tour the rest of the States for a couple of more weeks. At one point, the plane they were on caught on fire.
Wow.
And they had to do an emergency landing. And, when they landed, the Beatles get ushered off first. Everybody was on the plane, all the opening acts and Mal Evans and Brian Epstein and all their entourage, everybody was on the plane. But the Beatles got ushered off first. And my friends told me George was just ashen, as you said, just terrified.
Yeah.
They all were. I mean, they literally looked out and the engine was on fire, George, and they all thought, oh my God, we're Buddy Holly, man, this is going to happen.
Right. And they're just kids.
So,
they're just kids at that time, still in their early 20s. Yeah. And Mal Evans, by the way, was their road manager, right? Mal Evans. Yeah. Now, as for that documentary, you point out in the book, close to 200,000 feet of film was shot that night, but less than 5% was used. Why was that?
well, they had much, much more than they needed. They shot everything from them leaving the Warwick Hotel. They shot inside the helicopter. They shot absolutely everything. The parking lot filling up. But there was tons of footage on the Beatles that they didn't use. And the saddest part of that story is it got thrown away.
I was about to ask, where is it today? Yeah. It's gone.
It ended up on the cutting room floor, and no one. They were in a small editing facility, maybe 5 or 6 people, and none of those people thought, "Hey, this will be worth something 20 years from now."
So they were doubters like some of the others. Yeah, who cares? Throw it out.
I mean, this was it was untested ground. The whole thing. I mean, who knew? Really, who knew?
Exactly. Which leads to my last question for you, which is, what's the concert's most lasting effect? We know it's the first major stadium concert. It's a milestone in popular history. John Lennon later said, quote, "That concert in 1965 at Shea Stadium, I saw the top of the mountain on that unforgettable night." It's like a watershed moment, right? Because that changed how everything was after that in terms of live music.
Yes, I mean, absolutely everything. The first thing being technology. Woke up the next morning and said, "This is the future," and we failed. Nobody could hear them. Nobody could see them. And they got ready in a big hurry because 3 years later was Monterey Pop and 4 years later was Woodstock, and everybody could hear them there. So in those next few years, they got their act together. And 56,000 rock and roll fans had never been gathered in the same place before. And the impact on them personally was enormous. It changed. They realized we have power. We're a movement.
Financial standpoint too. A lot of the people, the people up top that were thinking money were like, "Oh, we can make some money off this."
Yeah, these kids are buying more than pimple cream here. We can make some money here. Barbershops were out. Men's hairstyling was in. Mini skirts, the London fashions came in, mod clothing. And quickly, Hollywood loosened up, and we very shortly after that saw nudity in film for the first time since the 1920s. So it was really the jumping off point, and cultural and pop history just changed dramatically from that night forward.
Top of the Mountain, the Beatles at Shea Stadium, 1965. Out now through Backbeat Books. And it is available wherever books are sold. Any websites that you want to let people know about? Social media pages?
I'm out there, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and my website is lauriejacobson.com. If you want a signed copy, write me at my website. Otherwise, as you said, it's available wherever books are sold.
Outstanding. Laurie Jacobson, thanks so much. This was great.
Eric, I loved your questions. It's a pleasure to talk to somebody who read the book before they talked to me. Thank you.
And as always, a big thanks to you for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.